February 1st, 1943, North Africa. The desert sun was beating down on the tarmac, but up at 25,000 feet, the temperature was minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a world where human beings couldn't survive for more than 2 minutes without oxygen. Sitting on the runway was tail number 124406, a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress. The crew called her the All-American. To understand what happened that day, you first have to understand the machine. The B-17 wasn't just an airplane, it was a flying battleship built by American industrial might. It was powered by 4 Wright 1820-97 Cyclone radial engines. Each engine pumped out 1,200 horsepower. That's 4,800 horses dragging 65,000 pounds of aluminum and high explosives into the sky. The skin of the aircraft was stressed aluminum. The skeleton was a complex lattice of ribs and spars designed to take punishment that would disintegrate any other aircraft in existence. American engineers at Boeing didn't design it to be pretty. They designed it to get shot at and come home. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg sat in the pilot's seat. He ran his hands over the throttles. He checked the oil pressure gauges. Green. Manifold pressure. Green. He was 24 years old, commanding a 10-man crew. They were about to fly into the heart of the German Luftwaffe over Tunis. They trusted the machine. They trusted American steel. But they had no idea that today, the laws of physics were about to be tested to their absolute breaking point. All-American, you are cleared for takeoff. Bragg pushed the 4 throttle levers forward. The Cyclones roared. The vibration rattled the teeth of every man on board. The bomber lumbered down the runway, fighting gravity, until the wings bit into the air and lifted the beast into the sky. As they climbed, the world changed. The warm air of the desert was replaced by the lethal cold of the stratosphere. The crew plugged in their heated flight suits. If those electric suits failed, frostbite would claim fingers and toes in minutes. They reached cruising altitude, 27,000 feet. The air was thin. The sky was a dark, bruised purple. Inside the fuselage, the noise was deafening, a constant 100-decibel drone of wind and engines. The navigator, Lieutenant Harry Nunez, checked his charts. They were heading for the German-controlled docks at Tunis. The bombardier, Lieutenant Ralph Berberidge, crawled into the plexiglass nose cone. He armed the Norden bomb sight, a computer so secret that crew members had to swear to destroy it with a gunshot if the plane went down. Everything was running by the numbers. Fuel flow was optimal. Formation was tight. But on the radar screens of the German airfields below, blips were already appearing. The Luftwaffe was scrambling. The hunters were coming up to meet the prey.
Bandits, 12 o'clock high. The calm was shattered by the voice of the top turret gunner. Out of the sun came the enemy, Messerschmitt Bf-109s. These were the sharks of the sky, fast, agile, and armed with 20mm cannons that fired explosive shells. The closing speed was terrifying. The B-17s were doing 200 miles per hour. The Germans were diving at 400 miles per hour. That's a combined closing speed of 600 miles per hour. Bragg held the formation steady. You don't turn a B-17 to dogfight. You fly straight and let your gunners do the work. The All-American bristled with .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat! The top turret opened fire. The vibration shook the entire airframe. Brass casings rained down on the floor. Tracers drew lines of fire across the sky. A Bf-109 singled out the All-American. It came in a steep dive, aiming for the cockpit. The German pilot held his trigger down. 20mm shells sparked off the B-17's nose. But the American gunners were good. They poured a stream of lead into the German fighter. Smoke erupted from the Messerschmitt. The German pilot was hit, or the controls were severed. The fighter went out of control. But instead of diving away, it rolled, it inverted, and it hurtled like a 3-ton missile directly at the All-American. There was no time to react. No time to bank, no time to scream. The crippled German fighter slammed into the rear fuselage of the B-17. Crunch! The sound wasn't an explosion. It was the sickening screech of tearing metal, like a god ripping a tin can in half. The 109's wing sliced through the B-17's fuselage just behind the waist gunner's windows. The impact was catastrophic. The B-17 shuddered violently, dropping 500 feet in seconds. Bragg fought the yoke, wrestling the giant plane back to level flight. "Report! Report! What the hell was that?" The waist gunner looked back toward the tail. His eyes widened in horror. He pressed his intercom button, but he couldn't speak at first. What he saw defied logic. The tail of the plane was gone. Well, not gone, but it shouldn't have been there. The collision had sliced through the top of the fuselage and most of the bottom. The entire tail section, the horizontal stabilizers, the vertical fin, and the tail gunner was hanging on by a few jagged strips of aluminum and one single bent longeron beam. You could see daylight through the fuselage. You could see the ground 25,000 feet below through the gaping hole in the plane. The aircraft was literally cut in half, held together by nothing more than American stubbornness and a few rivets.
The physics of flight are brutal. A plane needs structural integrity to transfer the lift from the wings to the stabilizers and the tail. The All-American had lost that integrity. The collision had severed the port horizontal stabilizer completely. The vertical fin was twisted. The fuselage looked like a shark had taken a bite out of it. The cut was 16 feet long and 4 feet wide. Lieutenant Bragg fought the controls. The yoke was shaking violently in his hands. The plane wanted to pitch down. It wanted to roll right. It wanted to die. Bragg analyzed the situation with the cold logic of an engineer. The control cables for the rudder and elevators were miraculously still intact, running along the very bottom of the floor, the only part of the frame that hadn't been severed. If he pulled back too hard, the tension would snap the fuselage. If he pushed forward, the negative G-force would rip the tail off. He had to fly a 30-ton bomber with the touch of a surgeon. He had to keep the airspeed exactly at 140 knots. Too fast, and the drag rips the tail off. Too slow, and the plane stalls, and the tail rips off. But the horror wasn't just structural, it was human. Inside the tail section, isolated from the rest of the crew, was the tail gunner, Sergeant Sarpolis. When the German fighter hit, Sarpolis was thrown around his small compartment like a die in a cup. He looked forward and saw the sky. The tunnel leading back to the main cabin was gone. There was just a gaping hole and the howling wind of the stratosphere. He was trapped in a metal box that was slowly detaching from the airplane. Every time the plane hit turbulence, the tail section wagged. It swung back and forth, grinding metal against metal. Sarpolis grabbed his intercom. It was dead. The wires were cut. He was alone. He crawled to the edge of the abyss. He looked across the 4-foot gap of torn metal at the waist gunners on the other side. They looked back at him with pale faces. They couldn't reach him. They couldn't throw him a rope. If he tried to jump across, the wind blast would blow him out into the void instantly.
The German fighters saw the collision. They saw the All-American cripple. In the brutal logic of aerial warfare, a damaged bomber is a free kill. It's a straggler. It falls out of formation, loses the protection of the group's overlapping fire, and gets picked apart. 2 Bf-109s circled back. They lined up for the execution run. They expected the American crew to bail out. They expected the plane to spiral into the desert. But the All-American didn't fall, and the guns didn't stop firing. Despite the fact that their plane was falling apart, the waist gunners and the top turret gunner stayed at their posts. They tracked the incoming Germans. Rat, 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 rat. The Germans were stunned. This broken wreck was still fighting back. The sheer volume of fire from the All-American forced the German aces to break off. They couldn't believe it. The plane looked like a ghost, a skeleton flying through the air, but it bit back like a rabid dog. The formation couldn't wait. The other B-17s had to maintain speed to reach the target and return. The All-American began to lag behind. They were alone, 300 miles from base. The wind chill factor inside the fuselage dropped to minus 60 degrees. The hole in the side acted like a massive scoop, funneling freezing air into the plane. The crew's heated suits were struggling. Their hands were numb. Their oxygen masks were freezing up. But the biggest enemy was vibration. A B-17 naturally vibrates, but now with the aerodynamics destroyed, the plane was shaking with a terrifying rhythmic thrumming, whump, whump, whump. Every vibration sent a shockwave through the single beam holding the tail. Bragg could feel it in the seat of his pants. He knew that metal suffers from fatigue. You can bend a paperclip back and forth a few times, but eventually, snap. He was counting the minutes. Every minute the tail stayed on was a statistical miracle.
They reached the coastline of North Africa. They were technically over friendly territory. Bragg faced the ultimate command decision. Standard procedure, bail out. The plane is unsafe. Save the crew. But Bragg ran the scenario in his head. The tail gunner, Sarpoulos, was trapped. If the crew bailed out, who would fly the plane steady for him to jump? He might be left behind to die in the crash. The turbulence. If the crew opened the hatches and jumped, the change in air pressure and weight distribution might cause the tail to snap immediately. The jumping men could be struck by the falling tail section. The parachutes. Several of the chutes were near the impact zone. Were they damaged? No one knew. Bragg got on the intercom. We are keeping her in the air. We are landing this thing. It was a pact. All or nothing. They would ride the ghost plane all the way to the ground. 3,000 feet. The airfield at Biskra was in sight. Now came the hardest part of the flight, the deceleration. As an aircraft descends, the air gets thicker. Denser air means more resistance. More resistance means more stress on the airframe. The tail of the All-American began to sway more violently. Left, right, left, right. It was swinging like a pendulum. Bragg signaled the tower. Emergency. Plane heavily damaged. Clear the runway. On the ground, the ambulance crews and fire trucks started their engines. They saw the dot in the sky. As it got closer, the binoculars went up and then dropped in disbelief. "That's not a plane," one mechanic shouted. "That's flying debris." Bragg had to make a choice. If he lowered the landing gear, the sudden drag might snap the tail. If he lowered the flaps to slow down, the change in lift might snap the tail. He decided to land hot, fast and flat.
Gear down. Bragg lowered the wheels. The hydraulics whined. The gear locked into place with a thud. The plane shuddered, but the tail held. Now he was 500 feet off the deck. Speed, 130 knots. He couldn't flare the nose up too high for landing. If the tail wheel hit the ground first, the impact would shatter the remaining metal beam. The fuselage would snap, and the tail section, with the gunner still inside, would tumble down the runway. He had to perform a wheel landing. He had to touch the front two wheels down first, gently, like kissing a baby, while keeping the tail flying in the air as long as possible. It required the precision of a surgeon operating with a sledgehammer. 200 feet, 100 feet, the desert floor rushed up to meet them. The main wheels kissed the tarmac. Screech! Smoke puffed from the tires. Perfect contact. But the danger wasn't over.
As the plane slowed down, the tail lost lift. Gravity began to pull the broken rear section down toward the concrete. Bragg fought to keep the nose up, letting the speed bleed off gradually. 80 knots, 60 knots. The tail wheel gently settled onto the runway. The broken metal groaned under the weight, but it didn't snap. The All-American rolled to a stop. The propellers spun down to a halt. Silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The crew couldn't believe they were stationary. Then the rear hatch opened. The tail gunner, Sam Sarpolis, climbed out. He walked around to the side of the fuselage, looked at the single beam of metal that had held his life for the last 90 minutes, and he fainted.
The ambulance crews didn't rush in. They walked. They approached the plane slowly, as if afraid that touching it would make it fall apart. They stared at the damage. It defied engineering logic. The tear was huge. You could drive a Jeep through the hole. The top turret gunner's oxygen system, the rudder cables, the electrical lines, everything was severed, except for one single longeron beam on the bottom right and a few inches of aluminum skin. Engineers later calculated that the structural integrity of the tail was less than 5%. By all laws of aerodynamics, the tail should have ripped off the moment the Messerschmitt hit it. By all laws of gravity, it should have snapped during the landing. But it didn't. Why? Because Boeing built it, and because an American crew refused to bail out on their ship. The photo of the All-American in flight became one of the most famous images of World War II. It was slapped on recruitment posters. It was pinned up in factories back home. It sent a message to the workers in Detroit and Seattle. Your work saves lives. And it sent a message to the Luftwaffe. You can cut us in half, and we will still come home. The All-American was eventually repaired and returned to service, because you can't kill a beast like that. This story isn't just about luck. It's about the durability of American engineering and the unbreakable spirit of the men who flew it. If you believe they don't make them like they used to, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories of steel and guts. And remember, physics is just a suggestion when you fly in a fortress.